So last time we talked about the hospitalizations. We've selected the hospitalizations of those above the age of 18. So this time we're going to talk about how to clean up the hospital uh, records. So why we need to clean up the hospital records. So I have a few slides to explain it. So in the raw data, it's always like this. So suppose this is one hospitalization record, this is another one. So for the same patient, suppose that there are five hospitalization records. Each hospitalization is going to have an admission date and a discharge date. So you can see that these records all are going to have different admission and discharge dates, right? But clearly, some of the hospitalization records are overlapping. For example, this one is kind of totally within this hospitalization. This one is partially overlapping with that. So it seems that for these three hospitalizations, we should get them aligned because it sounds like they are overlapping with each other. And these two are overlapping with each other, right? So we need to align that, and so following out the steps that we should do to clean it up. That's what I mean, clean it up here. So the first is that we need to sort all the hospitalization by admission date and then by discharge date. All right. So that way we will see we will clearly see for a following hospitalization, how is the relationship of the admission date to the previous admission and discharge date, and also for the discharge date, how is the relation to the previous ones. Okay, so the first step is to sort it by admission date. The next is, so the next part is that we're gonna see that for the second record, we're going to check the admission date with the discharge date of the previous one. So this step is to determine whether the uh, second hospitalization is overlapping with the first one. Because if the admission date is between the is within the hospitalization period of the first record, then the two are overlapping. All right. So if it is overlapping, then we're gonna extend the admission date and put it back to be as the same as the admission date of the previous record. All right. So that's the first thing we do. The second is that we're gonna check the discharge date. Right? So the discharge date versus the discharge date of the previous record. So this step is basically to check that if the discharge date is earlier than the previous one, then we're going to extend that. But in this case, it is not, so we're going to leave it there. So now, by looking at the first two records, we know that in the raw record, these two are overlapping with each other. Now by this change, then for the second record, now uh, we have the complete period between within the earliest admission date to the latest discharge date, right? So let's carry on for the third one. So again, we're gonna compare the admission date to the previous discharge date. So if it is earlier, so this admission date is earlier, then it is overlapping, and we're gonna do the same trick by extend that to the previous, but it's already adjusted admission date, right? So then we're gonna compare the discharge date, and if the discharge date is earlier than the previous one, we're gonna extend that again to be the same as the previous one. So now uh, compare the third one to the second and the first, we can see that the third one is going to have the most complete period, starting from the earliest admission date and the latest discharge date. All right, so among these three overlapping records. Okay, so now for the fourth one, because it is totally separated from the previous three, so there is a gap in between. So we don't think this one is overlapping with that, so we don't have to do anything about this one. So then the last one, again, the same trick in this time because it is overlapping. So we are gonna make an adjusted admission date and make it the same as the previous one, right? And for the discharge date, we don't have to do anything because this one is long enough. So after this adjustment, now the next thing we're going to do is that we're going to keep the longest because, among these three, this one is going to have the most complete hospitalization period. So in determination of the admission and discharge date of these overlapping hospitalizations, this one will have the most complete uh, uh, period, right? Within this admission date, the adjusted admission date and discharge date. And among these two, this will be the most complete one, right? So we're going to keep the longest among those overlapping ones, which is this one and this one. So now, in terms of the hospitalization period per se, we're going to have those adjusted periods that are going to taking care of all of these overlapping periods. So note that is not to say that we are going to delete this hospitalization. No, it's just that for the admission and discharge days, we're going to take these two. All right. So so in that case, by these definitions, we're going to have mutually exclusive hospitalizations for the same patient. Now, there are a lot of deviations. For example, you might have to take into consideration about, so what if these hospitalizations are from different hospitals or institutes or facilities? So in that case, despite that they are overlapping, should I consider that as one hospitalization episode or two? So that question is really specific to each research project. All right, so here I just simplify that. I put that as one. I just treat all the hospitalizations as if they are in one hospital. But there is always a way to go into that and to differentiate those hospitalizations from different periods. Anyway, so this is just for illustration purpose. I just make it simple here. So now we're going to have those mutually exclusive hospitalization periods. And remember that we still have to assign it back to each of the records. And now not only this record is going to have the adjusted admission and discharge dates, the previous two records will also have to update for that. All right, we're going to talk about that later. And it's the same for this record. It should have the same a discharge date as the last one. But anyway, we're going to talk about that later. All right. So now, so basically, as I said, we're going to have this clean hospitalization periods. And this is what I just talked about, which is the last step, is that for all the overlapping hospitalizations, we're going to have the same admission discharge date, right? So you might have a question to say that, well, so in that case, because we already have this hospitalization period, it sounds like it's quite complete. Why don't we just simply delete these two hospitalizations and delete this one? The answer is we can't, because in each hospitalization, you might have different information. For example, the diagnosis code in this 1 to 25 periods. So this hospitalization may have some of the interested the diagnostic code, and this hospitalization may have others, right? So if you delete any of them, then you're gonna lose some of the diagnosed code, and your case building will be incomplete. And that's why we have to keep all of these hospitalizations, but we need to adjust the admission and discharge dates. Okay, we've said enough, and now let's go back to the programs. So previously, we've saved the program as this version. This is October the 16th version, and now, oh my God, it's already 1 month. We're gonna save it as the new version, and this time I'm going to add a lot of other programs, and we're going to go through that one by one. But the one we're talking about, the cleaning up of the overlapping hospitalization records, will be in this program. But first, very importantly, is that we're going to run this settings, because the settings inside, we're going to set these libraries and so on and so forth. And also we're going to run all of these previous steps to make sure that we have all the data sets ready for this step. And that is very simple. We just select all of these programs, right click and say run selected. Okay, it is done. So now let's go into this program. So I'm going to enlarge it a little bit. Okay. So uh, So this one I forgot if I have mentioned that or not. So I always put this line first. This is just to clean up all this in SAS CGP, for example, you're gonna so every time you run the code, it's gonna generate a bunch of unused links. So this one is just to clean up the links. Anyway, so the next one is that we are gonna sort the hospitals like what we said before. So for to clean up the hospitalizations, we've said that the first step we're gonna do is to sort it, right? To sort it. So, right. So this is the way to sort it. We're gonna say proc sort. We have the source data, and it's going to be sorted by key HSM, is the patient ID, the admission date, and the discharge date, and that's it. So now the second step uh, is to do the following things. So in the second step, we're going to do this tricks like that. We're going to see whether or not we're going to have an adjusted discharge and admission and discharge dates. All right, so this is what we're going to do in the second step. And in SAS code, it's like this. So for each patient, we're gonna do it by each patient, and we're gonna check if it is the first record of the patient. So if it is the first record of a patient, so this is the way to say this is the first record of this key HSN, which is the patient ID. So in that case, we're going to have those redefined or retained or revised, whatever the admission date. We're going to let it be the same as the original admission date. So because this is the first record, right? And it's the same for the discharge date. And then we're going to remember the revised admission and discharge date. So this is very important. So the retain here means remember that. So the SAS program is going to remember that until the next time you update the value of the revised admission date or discharge date. So what are the cases that we're going to revise these dates? For example, you're going to change to a second patient, right? If you're going to change to the second patient, and at that time you're going to meet the first record of that patient. And in that case, you have to revise that. You have to re-update these values by the new admission and discharge date of the second patient. So you're going to have to revise one. But there are other cases that we are going to revise that, right? Anyway, here we're going to remember these values and we're going to retain these values, right? Unchanged, make it unchanged unless we ask the SAS program to change it. So this is for the first record. So if it is not the first record of that patient, what should we do? So the first is that we're going to check, like in this one. Actually, this line means that it means that, well, I'm going to check if this admission date is earlier than the discharge date. It's just like that. So that's this if. And if that is true, that the admission date is within, is earlier, then what shall I do? So then I'm going to check if the discharge date is long. So that will be applied to, like in this case, the third record, right? So we're going to check, well, is this one is earlier than this one? Yes. And in that case, what should we do for this discharge date? The part that we should update this, we should extend that and make it longer, right? So you might ask that, well, I didn't, in the code, I didn't see how you change this part. So go back to the chart. I already said in the code that if it is the first record of the patient, I'm gonna remember these admission date, and I'm gonna remember that and keep it unchanged. So when I say keep it unchanged, it means that for the second record, here, for the second record, I still want you to remember this revised admission date, which is the first admission date. All right, so I don't want you to change. So when I say retained, so the program is going to automatically use the remembered date as the admission date, and that's why we need this retain function. All right, so for the second record, what happened here is that because this one is longer, so I'm going to use this one as the revised or retained discharge date. And that's what you see here, right? So if that date is longer, then I'm going to use this revised discharge date. And these lines are going to solve the problem for these for these records. So if it is within, if this admission date is earlier than this, then I'm going to retain that. I'm going to use the remembered admission date, right? Now I'm going to check this discharge date. If it is the discharge date is longer than is later than this one, then I'm going to remember that, and I'm going to change the remembered or revised or retained discharge date to this value. So next time when I have the third record, again, so this one is within this, so I'm still going to use the remembered admission date. I didn't change that, right? However, for this discharge date is earlier than this one, so I'm not going to use this one. I'm going to use the remembered discharge date, which is this one. So now I have the complete report of that, right? So then I go to the fourth record, and this time what happened? So this time we have a new admission date which is later than the revised or remembered discharge date. All right, so now we have a new admission date which is later than this one. So this record is not overlapping with the previous one. So I'm going to remember this admission date again. And in the SAS code, it will be this part. It will be this part. It says else do. So what else? It says that Well, so previously we've said that if the admission date basically means that it is earlier than the discharge date. And now I'm saying that so if it is not that case, it is else, right? Then it means it is not that case. That admission date is later than that. If it is later than that, then I'm gonna update that admission date. And I'm also going to update the discharge date because now I have a non-overlapping record. Let's just go back again. See this. I have a non-overlapping record. It is not overlapping with the previous records. So I need a new admission date to remember, and I also need a new discharge date to remember. And then I'm going to do the same trick again. And 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 now for the fifth records, I'm going to do the same trick and have the revised admission and discharge date. So basically, that is the a typical process to clean up the overlaps, right? So that's the second step. So um, it took some practice to get used to that. It's simple, but it might be a little bit twisted if you were not familiar with that. But you know, by practicing, you will get used to that. All right. So once that is done, like I said, so now we need to have those admission and discharge dates that are not overlapping, right? So basically we're going to keep the last one. So that will be the step we in this PowerPoint we said that would be this one. So we're going to keep these two records, all right? So we keep these two records because we need to have this non-overlapping admission and discharge dates, and they are mutually exclusive, right? Okay, so this will be down in this step. So now we're going to have two data steps. One is called the BB1. So in this one, we have the revised or adjusted admission date and adjusted discharge dates, right? And we have this BB2. This BB2 is from BB1, but it only keeps uh, the ones with the longest discharge date, right? So why we have to keep both of them? This is basically to do the last step of that. So we are not going to really uh, delete these records. No, we're not going to do that. So instead, we're just going to update the discharge rate date with the revised discharge date, right? So how? Because in BB1, we already, for each of the record, we already have a revised admission date. That has been done. So if you go back and check the code, you will find that. And now we can link this BB1 with other records with BB2, which only have this record. And we're going to link that, and we're going to link that by patient and by their um, revised admission date. All right. So, which means that for these three records, we were gonna link that, and we will know that for these records, we should use this revised admission date in BB2, right? So it's the same for this case, and that's what the code is doing here in this step. So in this BB3, basically what we are doing is that we're going to change the discharge date again. And we're going to, for this overlapping period, so that for the overlapping period now, we're going to have the same revised admission date as well as the same revised discharge dates. And then we're going to rename that discharge date as the final discharge date. And that is done. Okay. So finally, we're gonna have one more step, which is that now we have the final discharge date. And in the original record, we have the revised date, which is not the same for these overlapping records. We're gonna dump that. So eventually we're gonna have this final discharge date, and we're gonna rename it back to those revised discharge date. And we're gonna save it. So the result is that we're still going to have the same number of records that we had before for those hospitalization records. It's just that uh, now we have a new uh, admission and discharge dates. For some of the records, like these two, they are overlapping, and now they are having the same admission and discharge dates. These three records are the same, right? Stuff like that. Okay. So now we've finished this part, and this is for the cleaning the hospital, the overlap